And our first speaker after lunch is Dr. John Felmy. Did I pronounce that correctly? Good. Dr. Felmy is Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute. He's responsible for overseeing economics, statistical, and policy analysis of the Institute. He has over 25 years' experience in energy, economic, and environmental analysis. He received his bachelor's and master's in economics from the Pennsylvania State University and a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be here, and I want to reiterate the point that's just made about Bob's presentation. That was truly energizing, because the points that he's making have to be repeated over and over and over again, because too often the politics of what we're seeing right now is getting in the way. Want to also thank you all for having me. It's always good to come to an oil area, because I did go to the Pennsylvania State University, which would suggest to you that I'm probably a native Pennsylvanian, which I'd like to point out to everybody was the first oil state. And I actually grew up in the north central part of the state, the part of Pennsylvania that I think Lee Atwater called two cities separated by Alabama. So I grew up in that part of the state, and we had oil, gas, coal, so it was a hydrocarbon economy. My father was a coal miner until one mine caved in on him, and then he got out okay, but he decided to get a new line of work. And as a mere child, I worked on a pipeline in Pennsylvania, the original major oil pipeline in the state of Pennsylvania, which was the Tidewater oil line, which was laid by hand across the Allegheny Mountains by the independents trying to break John D. Rockefeller's hold on transportation. And they did it, they finished it. It was a cast iron line screwed together with collars, dug by hand, and finished in 1879. And so I worked on a repair crew on that as a child. But then I turned down an honorable profession and turned to the dark side and became an economist. And so since I've never seen most of you all here, it gives me an opportunity to torture you after lunch with an economist joke. So there are many definitions of an economist, of course, usually on one hand, one on the other hand, one arm or the other. But my favorite one is an economist is somebody who's real good with numbers, but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. So if we could put up the first set of slides to get started, what I'm going to do is talk about where we are in terms of energy prices, gasoline prices, crude oil prices, diesel prices, and so on, and what's going on with the market, because it's a thing that I'm asked more than virtually anything else. And then what I'll turn to briefly is, well, what is the industry doing about it right now? Second of all, what's the industry doing about it longer term? Next, what should be done in terms of the government policies of the type that Bob has mentioned? And most importantly, what shouldn't they do? So what I'm going to do is, first of all, start with the most important graph that I use in any of my discussions. You know, we have a problem in the oil industry, as Bob quite rightly pointed out. We've done a terrible job educating people. People really don't know the fundamentals of the oil and gas industry. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know, for example, the largest supplier is Canada. They don't know what earnings of the industry are, and on and on and on. And so in that vein, we conducted an energy IQ survey of 1,300 folks to find out what they knew. And unfortunately, we found that in many cases, fully a quarter of the people who answered said they didn't know. And even worse, folks were completely convinced in the wrong answer. So if you want to go to our website, you can find that energy IQ survey, and it'd be interesting because it'll point out what the questions are, what the correct answers are, and then what people actually answered. And so for you legislators, it will be helpful, I think, to you to understand why you get some crazy questions. Because people simply aren't informed, and it's the industry's fault. And as Bob mentioned, you know, having J.R. Ewing as a spokesperson was probably not a good idea, or Jed Clampett for that matter. So, you know, we have this, and we are continuing to commit to an education process as an industry. We're going out and speaking with groups such as yourself, Chambers of Commerce, Rotaries. We're doing educational outreach. We're doing advertising on education to get the facts out. Because right now in Washington, what's going on is basically a complete misrepresentation of the facts on the industry. And unfortunately, because the folks out there don't know what the facts are, they tend to believe they're elected officials. And it's really unfortunate because perhaps the worst energy policies since the days of Jimmy Carter could be enacted unless we see some rationality introduced it. Now, the chart that I put up there is the most important chart because for you all, you probably know what is the most important number on the face of the earth, and that's 42, which is the number of gallons in a barrel. Now, if you look at the bottom line, that's the price of crude oil in dollars per gallon, because you divide, for example, we had $132.19 per barrel on Friday. That works out to $3.14 per gallon. So remember that number, $3.14 per gallon on Friday. The top two lines are, first of all, gasoline and then diesel, and I'll explain the differences in a minute. But when you start with $3.14 per gallon, add on, for example, 36 cents in taxes that you have here in New Mexico, you've already got a base price of the product. In other words, a base cost before you refine, market, transport, or deliver it of $3.50 a gallon. So what's going on with prices? Very simply, the price of crude oil, the price of manufacturing the product has gone up. And that's something that isn't easily, and when I saw the hearings, for example, last week, I was stunned as though this very simple fact just wasn't recognized by a lot of the legislators. The fact of the matter is the cost of crude oil has gone up dramatically. So if we turn forward and say, well, how much has it changed over the past past year, for example? Well, prices go up and down a lot. So what I do is I take an average, for example, from the year to date, January 1 to yesterday, and compare that for crude oil costs, gasoline, and diesel. And what you see is quite instructive. Now, they've changed a little bit because they change by the day, but what you see is basically the cost of crude oil is up, a dollar, let's see, my vision, I have to make sure, it's $1.05 a gallon, and it's up a little more, about $1.07 now. The price of diesel is up $1.08 a gallon, and gasoline's up 70. And so what you see is the input costs of the product have gone up. In the case of gasoline, more than the price of gasoline has gone up. In the case of diesel, about the same. And so that, in a nutshell, is what's happening with the prices that people pay at the pump. Nothing more, nothing less, and I'll talk a little bit about what else goes into that in a moment. But that leads, of course, to the question, well, why is gasoline and diesel different? Or why are gasoline and diesel different? Well, the main thing is they're two separate markets. First of all, in both cases, the refinery system has produced record amounts of product this year so far. Record amounts. And I emphasize that because we have constant attacks by consumer groups and the groups that Bob has mentioned saying, oh, you're deliberately trying to constrain output so you can drive up price. Nonsense. The refinery system is producing record amounts, and so making an argument that somehow you're trying to constrain things is just plain silly. Arguments that there's market power or something like that make absolutely no sense. What's going on with gasoline? Well, gasoline has, first of all, in addition to record production, you've also got second highest level of imports of gasoline, because we import about 10% of our gasoline supplies primarily from various parts of the world. We've also got weak demand for gasoline this year. Bob pointed out that even with the higher prices last year, you had gasoline demand up. Well, that's turned some, so that now, year-to-date, gasoline demand is down about 0.5%. So what do you have? You have strong supply, weak demand, and like any product, whether it's selling widgets or whether it's selling gasoline, you can't always pass along your costs. And so what you see is the price of gasoline increase less than the input costs that you have. Diesel market is a little different. Yes, you have record production, but you've also got lower imports. And why is that? Well, because there's less diesel available on world markets. What we see is the world is turning to diesel engines because they're higher compression so that you get better efficiency and you get more energy content in a gallon of diesel than you do gasoline. So the world is really turning, and so there's less diesel available on world markets. And we in this country have a predominant system that's focused on gasoline, where the other parts of the world focus on diesel. So imports are down. Now, what about demand? Well, demand for diesel actually is pretty strong. Year to date, it's running about 6%. And that's because you don't have the flexibility if you are driving and shipping with truck that you do with a gasoline. You can't use a smaller car, you can't combine trips, you basically have to use diesel for your business. And so diesel continues strong. And so, like any other markets, you've got a tighter market for diesel. And so that explains what's going on very clearly. And so other factors that come to play at diesel too is that it's not your father's diesel fuel. We've turned diesel into ultra-low sulfur diesel, 15 parts per million. That's a very expensive program. It also is out of sync with other world economies where, for example, Europe is at 50 parts per million. And that also tends to influence the amount of imports. So that in a nutshell is what's going on, the cost of manufacturing the product. Now, why is crude oil so expensive? Now, Bob went through most of these things in the litany of things you've already heard. You know, strong demand in India, China, and now just recently the Middle East. Because in a somewhat a bit of a puzzle, the Middle East increases demand when prices go up, and that's because of the wealth effect. But now, when you take China and the Middle East together, it's 1/2 of world demand. And India is right behind China, and India has largely been service-dominated in terms of its growth, but now it's turning to large industrial growth, and demand there for all types of energy should grow significantly in order to be able to support that demand growth. It's also things like OPEC. You know, we hear OPEC saying it's not us. Well, the fact is OPEC production last year was down by 700,000 barrels a day. They just announced that Saudi Arabia's production was down 400,000 barrels a day. At the same time, worldwide demand was up 1.1 million barrels a day. So I'd be cautious when you hear folks saying, it's not us, you know, because the fact of the matter is, whether it was by choice or not, it doesn't matter, their production was down. And in the case of Nigeria, clearly, it's a struggle there in terms of the unrest they have. Iraq, you know, it's hard to produce oil when people are shooting at you. And we just saw, for example, Russia has a decline in production for the first time in 10 years. Going forward, there are other things that have happened. You know, the dollar has an impact, of course, because, as Bob mentioned, other currencies, if you have other currencies, it means the relative increase in price has been less than what we've experienced in this country. The world consumption chart just shows what's going on that I mentioned in terms of China, India, and the Middle East. We've also got a limited amount of spare capacity. You know, we've been talking about jawboning OPEC in terms of increasing production. Well, we don't know how much they really can increase production. You know, estimates are that it's about 2 million barrels a day of excess capacity that's not being used, but we don't know what kind of oil that is. You know, is it a heavy, high sulfur oil that you may not be able to refine because of limited capacity? You know, we simply don't know that, but there is limited capacity. And so any kind of a potential disruption, whether it be hurricanes or whether it be demand surge or anything like that, is a real challenge in terms of what could happen with world markets. I'll skip over this. This is a chart that shows the forecast. We don't forecast prices because of antitrust law, but I want to point out that all of you can get these slides from our website by just going to our website, which is api.org, and in the search box, type in primer, and you'll have the latest one that pops up, and it's got all these slides, and it's updated on mostly a weekly basis. So don't feel the need to scroll down a lot of numbers because it's all easily available. And since you have copies of it here, I'd be happy that you can circulate it for anyone who wants it here at the conference. We also have seen commodity increases in terms of other things. Most of this, again, is the China factor. If you've got half of the world's cranes operating in Shanghai, you can see how much of the demand for steel is and other types of commodities. We've seen the demand for agricultural commodities because of the growth in demand for more grain, better nutrition, more meat, things like that. And in the case of other types of commodities, you do have a movement by some funds into it. And that's important in terms of non-oil commodities because you could store most of the world's gold in this facility here, but you can't do that with crude oil. So there could be very clearly some demand pressures in those other commodities, but oil is not alone in that regard. This just measures the difference between the blue line is the price of oil in US dollars, and the red lines are the price on the left in euros, and the price on the right in yen. And that tells you that all of the things equal, when the dollar depreciates, it increases the relative demand for oil. Now, when you break everything down, you know, we talk about what goes into that price. I talked about, you know, that you've got $3.14, you've got 36 cents in taxes. Well, when you break it down into broad categories, 70% for March, for January through March, was due to crude oil alone. 17% was refining and marketing, and 13% was taxes. Now, we get profit as an industry from a couple of those shares. Of course, producing crude oil. If you produce crude oil, you've done quite well. Refining didn't do so well. In fact, many refiners in the first quarter lost money. So I hear these allegations, oh, well, you're just manipulating the market and it's because of refining capacity. Again, it's utter rubbish. Refiners, you know, a couple independent refiners like Sunoco and Tesoro lost money, and the integrated companies didn't do very well either. And of course, taxes are nationwide an average of 46 cents per gallon in terms of taxes, and that works out to 13%. But if you look at earnings for the industry, which is what everybody was fulminating on last week, for the first quarter, it worked out to 7.5 cents on the dollar. So I hear this constant refrain from candidates and politicians saying, this is excess profits you're making. Nonsense. If you compare that to what the Dow Jones Industrial Average companies did, even with the huge losses from some of the financial write-downs, the latest data we had was it was about 6.9 cents on a dollar. So saying this is out of line and it's windfall profits is just political rhetoric and no basis in fact. If you look at our returns on investment, this just demonstrates we don't make anything out of line from the rest of, for example, the S&P industrials. It's a fair rate of return for what the companies have to do when you risk $1 billion on a platform halfway around the globe that may end up in dry holes. So once again, the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. These are the 2007 earnings. We don't have the first quarter of 2008 yet from the Commerce Department, but it basically shows you that the average for 2007 was 8.3, slightly higher. If you compare that to all manufacturing, it was 7.3, but if you take out the car companies themselves, which have had a real struggle with everything they're going through, and just net that out, it works that the average manufacturing industry made more than the oil industry. And that certainly is true of pharmaceuticals, computers, and many other industries that are consumer-oriented. So this rhetoric that is in Washington that we're just basically going to take your windfall profits away, again, doesn't match reality. We also hear in Washington, oh yeah, we're just going to take money from the oil companies. And I like to joke, it seems as though some politicians seem to think our companies are owned by space aliens, when in fact they're owned by millions of Americans. It isn't a question of John D. Rockefeller owning everything anymore. Although, you know, Bill Gates doesn't own a huge share of his company, but he doesn't seem to get mentioned in all of this. But if you look at IRAs and pension funds alone, that's 41% of the shares of the companies. And millions of other Americans own those through their mutual funds and other types of investments. So when you hear a politician say, I'm going to take money from the oil industry, grab your wallet, because it's coming out of somebody's pocket. It's not going to come out of thin air. We also have criticisms as an industry that, oh, well, you're not investing enough. Well, I'll show you the investments in a minute, but I heard just unbelievable criticisms that the industry is repurchasing stock as though that's a horrible thing to do. Again, it's not simply true. You know, if you look at the comparison of how much the oil industry purchases as a share of its net income, the lower line, and you compare that to the S&P industrials, you see that they purchase at a rate less than half. So the fact of the matter is the industry is doing what's appropriate for their shareholders. And his argument is somehow you're doing the wrong thing, and I've heard a whole host of other people make this claim, just simply don't jibe with reality. We also as an industry pay a lot in taxes, huge amount, $90 billion in terms of all the actions. So when you combine that with what the industry pays in royalties, in terms of rentals, in terms of bonus bids, in terms of everything, the industry pays a huge amount of money to be able to do business in this country. And these attacks and demonization of the industry simply don't make sense. If you look at the tax rate alone for the industry, on the right-hand side, if you look at net income as a share, taxes as a share of net income before taxes, which is a real mouthful to say, it's 40.7%. You compare that same measure to manufacturing, it's 22.1, so almost twice. So again, the industry pays its fair share of what is happening in terms of being eligible to do business here. We also invest a vast amount of money. If you look at the total, for example, in 2007, it was $175 billion. That compares to net income of $155, and this year it's trending close to $200 billion investments. In other words, what you need to do is invest money for tomorrow's energy. And in most of the proposals that they're saying is we're just going to take money from the oil industry, a repeat of Jimmy Carter's windfall profits tax. Those are investments that aren't going to be made in terms of future energy. And so explain to me how that helps consumers. The answer is it doesn't. And then you know what will likely happen with the money? Well, the same thing that happened with the windfall profits tax. It's largely going to be frittered away. You know, there's nothing in Washington more dangerous than a pot of money, because it'll turn into earmarks and spending that will ultimately not advance what you need as a society. And so these arguments that somehow this is the good thing to do, tax the oil industry and spend it on whatever I want, don't add up. Again, this is the investment in earnings over time. We invest more than our net income is from a statistical sense. Bob mentioned that we've expanded the existing capacity by 20% over the last 10 years. Yes, we have lost refineries. That's the line that's going down, but the capacity expansion that's gone on is the equivalent of a new refinery every year within the existing gates. In other words, the NIMBYs, the NOPEs. I would add one other one that I've heard, Bob, and that's if those folks who you mentioned actually go on to hold public office, there's a new one that we add, and that's NIMTO, which is not in my term of office. So it's yet another reason that we see in terms of not being able to expand capacity. We also have expanded, in terms of environmental expenditures, a vast amount of money. In the refinery system alone, we've spent $55 billion on cleaner fuels, reducing emissions, and environmental improvement. And that's a huge amount of money that could have been spent on other things, such as expanding capacity, but the industry is committed to these new environmental improvements. But that's probably the equivalent of 10 to 20 additional refineries that could have been built if we didn't have to spend it on those things. We'd also like to spend money on more exploration. But if you look, there's wholesale areas of the country that are off limits. East Coast, West Coast, Eastern Gulf of Mexico. Bob mentioned the Florida conundrum. And it's interesting because they actually do produce oil in South Florida, in Grand Cypress. And nobody seems to know that. So oil is not a foreign thing to Florida. In fact, Florida was actually developed by one of John D. Rockefeller's right-hand men. So we'd like to produce more, but we can't. If it's off limits, you can't produce it. Bob mentioned some of the limitations in terms of species and seasonal limitations and so on, and that is true for oil and natural gas. Over 600 trillion cubic feet of gas could be produced that could help consumers. But if you can't get at it, you can't produce it. Now, let me turn quickly to a couple things in terms of policy, and then I'll shorten it. Basically, going forward, we're going to need energy of all types, as Bob mentioned. We're going to need oil, coal, gas, nuclear. We're going to need renewables, solar, wind, geothermal. We're going to need energy efficiency, because the projections of energy efficiency are pretty dramatic, but it won't be enough. Because even with the improvements in energy efficiency, we're still going to need more oil and energy, because we're going to have a population that's going to go up by 20% and a GDP that's going to double. So we're going to need all of these things, and if you just start taking things off the table, you won't have enough to supply consumers. This chart just basically says that, we're going to see growth in alternatives, but if you look at oil and gas alone, they may decline in market share a little bit from 62% to 54%, and oil, coal, and gas will decline from 85% to 80%, but they still are the dominant share. These other technologies play a very important role in terms of additional supplies, but they're very small, they're very expensive. And one of the things that people seem to forget, the rhetoric is always, we need alternatives, we need alternatives. Well, remember that most of the alternatives that people are talking about are electricity. We don't have a fleet of electric cars, and we won't have a fleet of electric cars for a long time that could use that electricity. I think that's a good opportunity. Plug-in hybrids could be a good introduction, but they're not that big right now in terms of the fleet size, and with the cost of batteries and so on, it's hard to see how fast they're going to be able to grow. The one fuel that is being developed, as Bob has mentioned, is cellulosic technology could be a holy grail. If you can turn waste into fuel, that is a tremendous opportunity. But they've been talking about it for 20 years. 20 years ago, I remember one of the ethanol folks quipped that 20 years ago I thought it was 5 years away. I still think it's 5 years away. And so the question is, will that be able to develop? I certainly hope so, because I think it could be a good opportunity. But as others have mentioned, you can't grow your way out of imports. If you look right now, the next slide will show that 25% of our corn crop goes to ethanol, and this year it could be 33%. And if you grew the entire farmland in the United States, you wouldn't equal the gasoline supply. But people say, well, I'm not sure I believe that, because Brazil is energy independent because of that. Well, Brazil is energy independent, but not primarily because of ethanol. Brazil is energy independent primarily because of oil and gas. Yes, ethanol had some impact, but you can see how small to the left ethanol is in market share, and it's helped. But the main reason Brazil is energy independent is that you've gone from 200,000 barrels a day of production in the early 80s to 2 million barrels a day. And it's no mystery that the president of Brazil announced energy independence on an oil platform and not an ethanol refinery. So yes, ethanol will play a growing role, but it's a challenge. Skip over that, I mentioned that. It was mentioned that we invest in alternatives. The oil industry is the largest investment in emerging energy alternatives, frontier hydrocarbons. We also invest in energy efficiency. We invest in non-hydrocarbons, solar, wind, geothermal. For example, BP is a very large solar supplier. And these are the breakouts that you see. Yes, they're not as big as what their conventional oil and gas investments are, but you've got to keep gasoline flowing 24/7, first of all, and then you look forward to the future. The world, the situation is the same as the U.S. Growing demand, we're going to need all supplies of all types. This slide just says, and it was pointed out earlier in another point, that the U.S. oil companies, the international oil companies, are small players in the scale of national oil companies. And if you look at the rankings, you can see how far they drop down compared to, say, Saudi Aramco. Production's a little more out of the resources, but it's still, they're small players on the global stage. This just says that, I'll skip over it, it's basically Canada's our largest supplier of imported oil. And finally, let me close. What do we need in proper energy policy? We need energy efficiency first and foremost. We need investments in technologies. We need to reduce barriers to producing more oil. We need to rely on market forces. You know, in addition to the tax policies that we saw before, one of the things that scares an economist most are some of these price discussions that are going on. They usually come under the category of price gouging. Well, price gouging, the way these things are written, could easily turn into price controls. And many of you folks are old enough to remember gas lines. It wasn't embargoes or it wasn't shortages of supplies that caused gas lines. It was price and allocation controls. Bad government policies that hand in hand with windfall profits tax really caused us problems in the early 1980s. We need to recognize that we're on a world scale and we have to compete there with everything because the companies are going to have to be competing with the national oil companies of China, India, and so on and so forth. So we do need to look forward to energy policies that make sense. But right now, all I see is a rhetoric that we'll take money from the oil industry and spend it on whatever we want. That's failed in the past. It's a repeat of the mistakes of the past, and I would hope that going forward, it really doesn't happen, and we repeat that mistake again and again and again. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.